This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Ken Banks is the founder of Kiwanjanet and creator of Frontline SMS. He devotes himself to the application of mobile technology for positive social and environmental change in the developing world. He has worked at the intersection of technology, anthropology, conservation, and development for the past 20 years, and during that time has lived and worked across the African continent. He's a PopTech Fellow, a Tech Awards Laureate, an Ashoka Fellow, and a National Geographic Emerging Explorer. And he's been internationally recognized for his technology-based work. In 2013, he was nominated for the TED Prize. Ken is also a published author with his first edited book, The Rise of the Reluctant Innovator, released in late July 2013. His latest project, Means of Exchange, looks at how everyday technologies can be used to democratize opportunities for economic self-sufficiency, rebuild local community, and promote a return to local resource use. I spoke with Ken in Cambridge. Hi there, Ken. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hey, you're welcome. It's good to be here.
You know, it's sort of mid-June when we're recording this, June 18th, and I'm lucky enough to be sitting in Costa Rica. Where do I find you today?
I'm sitting in my global HQ, which is a small, 4-meter square office above a supermarket in a town called St Ives in Cambridgeshire. It's my little space where I escape and think and do stuff.
You know, I'm really excited to figure out how you got into that 4-meter square space. Most famously, you are the founder of Frontline SMS. The project you're working on, I'm hopefully not going to butcher this, is Kiwanja.net.
Yeah, Kiwanjanet is the organization I run, which basically houses all of my projects and crazy ideas. And Frontline SMS was originally one of those projects and crazy ideas.
Okay, so take us and tell us about Kiwanja.net. How did this get started? How did you find yourself starting this? And just give us an overview of what it does.
So in 2003, I found myself, there's a whole story before that point, but we can look at that later maybe. But 2003, I found myself very fortunate to be in a position to start looking at mobile technology in development. And it was very early on. There weren't many people really working on it at that point. You know, mobile coverage was pretty rare, and certainly in rural areas in many developing countries. Phones were expensive. When I told people I was looking at mobile technology in Africa, people would sort of laugh at me and wonder what the hell I was doing. Today, people laugh if you say you're not looking at mobile technology in Africa. So it's completely flipped. But I was doing some work in 2003 at a conservation organization in Cambridge, which is actually why I now live here. And I realized that there were more than just the single NGO I was working for at the time who were asking all these questions. You know, how useful can mobile technology be? How do we build the most appropriate tools? How do we keep it inclusive? How do we work out what the real problems are and what the real potential is? And I just felt it was probably a good idea at the time to start sharing the things that I was learning quite early on. So about 6 months into that contract in June 2003, I just created Kiwanja.net, picked a name that sounded quite interesting, and then just started the organization. And really it was just doing a lot of sharing and kind of informal consultancy, you know, just answering people's emails and pointing them to things and just becoming a little bit of a resource for people interested in mobile for development. And it's really grown from there.
So what's the sexiest project you're working on right now? I know you've got Means of Exchange. You contribute to a number of different projects. What are you excited about today?
Well, you know, I've been working on an idea for a mobile app for a little while. In fact, for about 8 years. And I feel now the time is right.
I think that's the standard development time for any good idea, right? It's like a decade sort of arc.
Yeah, you know, I was a little bit ahead of the time, I guess. It demanded smartphones and all this kind of stuff when I first started thinking about it, and they didn't really exist in 2007, and they're clearly around now, particularly in the market I live in. So, I mean, I'm quite excited about potentially developing, you know, my first mobile app. It's, based around giving, and we'll see how that goes. I'm also reworking the book, so The Rise of the Reluctant Innovator, which was self-published about 18 months ago, through Kickstarter money and personal donations and personal money, has actually turned out to be, you know, quite a success in its own right, and it's been attracting a lot of interest from academia and from particularly young people interested in social innovation, and it became clear there was more potential for a slightly restructured, perhaps better structured book. So I now have a professional publishing deal with Kogan Page, who are one of the leading publishers in Europe, and I'm working with them to rework the book with a few more case studies, structure the chapters in a more useful way, and publish that next spring. So that's pretty exciting too.
Can you give us a synopsis? What's the thesis in The Rise of the Reluctant Innovator?
Well, the concept is, for me, that over the years I've seen what I would say has been an increasing institutionalization of social change and maybe international development. So it's a general sense or a general message that many younger people interested in the subject are getting, and incorrectly in my view, is that you need to go and study design thinking, you need to get a degree in international development, you need to go and do a course on social entrepreneurship, you need to go through all this process. And my experience over the 23 years now or so I've been working in development is that you don't need qualifications to make a difference in the world. And so the premise of the book is that actually a lot of the really, really interesting stuff happening out there today isn't happening from people who have gone through an education process and come out with a qualification. It's people who get their backsides out there. They take the time, put the effort in to actually get into the field, to understand the people they want to help, gain some empathy, and then quite often the problem finds them rather than the other way around. So the book is just a series of case studies of people who completely randomly came across things that ended up really troubling them to quite an extent. They ended up then changing their lives and altering the course of their lives to fix the problem. And in some cases, it was reluctantly, which is where the title comes from. These people were fairly happy with things before they discovered these, huge health inequalities and various human rights issues. And they sort of basically made their lives a lot more complicated than they had to by taking those problems on. I think a lot more development is going to happen that way.
Can we assume that reluctant is a good label to give you as well? Back in 2003, you said, you were working on this nice climate change thing and you stumbled upon some problems. Would that characterize your career path thus far?
Yeah, I think the reluctance is an interesting word, and I liked it in the book title because it can have positive and negative connotations. Of course, I looked to the positive side, but for me, absolutely, I was doing my work. I came across a problem. I came across this communication problem around Kruger National Park, where conservation groups were trying to communicate with communities, and there was no way of doing it. And I realized quite early on that there weren't enough people really in the field seeing these kinds of problems, and there certainly weren't people building tools that could be used in those kinds of places. And I felt if I didn't fix it, if I didn't build something to address it, then possibly nobody else would. And that's really where I guess the course of my life changed.
I want to harken back, you said 2003 is when you sort of rocked up and started this process. So far in this interview, we've heard, a lot about technology, social innovation, humanitarian aid. Is that where you started? What happened before 2003? Were you a coder somewhere? Were you working for high technology and you stumbled into humanitarian aid, or how did you get started?
Yeah, quite a bunch of things, I guess. The Kiwanjanet strapline, before I did some rebranding work recently, was where technology meets anthropology, conservation, and development. And that's my passions in life. I've been doing technology work since I was a teenager, where I taught myself to program Commodore PET computers, and I found that I was actually quite good at it. They weren't teaching it at school back then, so I didn't get any formal qualification. Still don't actually have any formal qualification in that. Been self-taught the whole way. But in 1985, I actually saw Live Aid, saw this global rock concert which Bob Geldof and his crew put on. And
thank you so much for putting Live Aid in this. That's so fantastic.
There we go.
Yeah. I was definitely a member of that.
You couldn't avoid it if you were around in 85. And it was sort of ironic for me. I was born in Jersey in the Channel Islands. It's an offshore banking center. In 1985, I was working in finance. I was delivering gold bullion to banks and, carrying bits of gold and platinum around in suitcases, and had a pretty good life, I guess. I saw Live Aid, and it really opened my eyes to parts of the world that I didn't really, I was shocked, obviously, like most people were, what I saw, and really started on the journey of thinking about, how on earth could I possibly contribute to finding solutions to these kinds of problems? So, in the mid 80s and even into the 90s, though, if technology was all you really had to offer and you were interested in international development, then there wasn't much you could do. There were projects where you could go and install Novell networks in rural hospitals that would probably never get used. Or you could go and build a dam, or if you're a doctor, you could do something pretty cool. But it was pretty limited for people with technology. So, I just carried on learning. I would say probably in my career, I spent 3/4 of it just learning. So in 1993, I went to Zambia. There's a bit of a gap, obviously, between 85 and 93. I just read lots and studied lots. But in 93, I went to Zambia to help build a school and really to start getting a flavor of what life was really like for people living on $2 a day or maybe $1.50 a day, whatever it would have been back then. Because I felt there was no way I could really understand how I could help solve some of these problems if I didn't understand the people who were facing the problems and didn't actually see the problems at first hand. And I think that's one of the big problems we have actually today with the sector, is not enough people spend the time and the effort to kind of go out and empathize and learn about the context of the people that they want to help. But I went out in 93, helped build this school. I went to Uganda in 95 to help build a hospital. At that point, decided, look, I want to turn my back on finance, turn my back on spending probably the rest of my life helping make other people rich, and figure out whether I could find some way of helping these people I was meeting on my journey who, through no fault of their own, were seriously struggling to keep themselves and their family alive. And I felt very bad about that. I felt very guilty that I was born on the side of the fence that didn't have those kinds of problems. And maybe guilt isn't a word we like to use too much in the international development space, but I did genuinely feel guilt. So again, I couldn't do much with technology at that time. So I went to university. I studied social anthropology with development studies to try and just get a better understanding of the historical roots of development, just to try and get a sense of what was going wrong. Because from 85 up to 96, when I went to university, all I'd really read about was the failures of international development, how nothing really seemed to get fixed. It was all plaster over, open wounds and this kind of stuff. And I wanted to try and study and understand it. And the social anthropology for me was the kind of key bit in a way. I didn't realize at the time, but we so often think about the people last when we do so many of the projects these days. We are more focused on the technology or more focused on a specific agenda, and we sometimes forget that at the end of the day, it's people that really have to benefit. Otherwise, there's probably no point in doing it. So I went to university and studied it there.
I'd like to go a little deeper on that particular topic. Your latest blog post on Kiwanjanet is fixing development, the real grand challenge of development. Clearly, this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart and something you want to focus on. Understanding the people, for my colleagues or our colleagues who are listening to this podcast right now who worked for some of the larger development organizations, quote unquote, Beltway bandits, around the DC area or in the UK or those places, they'd say, hey, you know what, we go out and do needs assessments. We go out and we do the field work and gather the data before we put our proposal together, et cetera, so that we understand the ground situation. We understand, how our initiative is going to affect that community and the people. Does that not play in your mind, or what's the disconnect there?
Well, I think there's a difference between going out with no agenda to simply listen and learn and live with people and genuinely spend time trying to understand people than flying in for 2 weeks with a survey, asking lots of questions, perhaps getting the answers that the people you've asked think you want to hear rather than the genuine answers. You can understand so much about the dynamic of communities and the dynamics of problems by simply sitting and observing over a period of time. There's no shortcut to that. There's absolutely no shortcut. You find it funny when people say to you, well, I've been to Lagos for 3 or 4 weeks, so I can tick Nigeria off my list. I mean, that's the most ridiculous thing to say, yet you sort of hear it quite often.
Absolutely.
So absolutely, field work's important. You need to get out and do the research and do get the baseline data and so on. But I don't think it's by any means you get the empathy that you need and the genuine understanding you need by just doing that.
Is there anyone or any organization other than Kiwanjanet that you'd consider a leader in this, a thought leader, someone who's doing it right?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm sort of a leader or a thought leader. I think the beauty for me is I work on my own, so I can do things the way I feel they need to be done rather than have to toe any particular line. And I can also write anything as well that I feel needs to be written, which is a nice kind of position to be in. And I've deliberately chosen to be that way. But I think there is a general problem. I think development has become so institutionalized now. It's really quite scary. And I do find it incredibly frustrating that some of the problems that we see today have been around for a very, very, very long time. And most people that work in the sector recognize the problems, yet there seems to be no will or no ability to fix them. And, some of the stuff I see it just really, really gets to me. And it particularly gets to me when I think about the times I've spent on the ground, for example, running a primate sanctuary in Nigeria in 2002, where I spent a year. It cost $200 to run that sanctuary for a month. They had a brilliant education program reaching out to Nigerian youth, a forest site to try and encourage communities near the forests, not cut the trees down. They fed the primates, they did the veterinary stuff, they hired 20 local staff, $200 a month to run a really brilliant grassroots primate conservation project. $200, though, pays for a consultant for 3 hours of his day or her day. It pays for the sandwiches at a lunchtime brown bag meeting. I just see so much money going into things and being misdirected that when I think about what it could do, it just feels a little bit immoral. But the only way the system is going to change is for the people that benefit from it to want it to change. And it's really hard to get people to do that because they benefit from it.
Many people who are listening to this podcast right now will be listening to it because of Frontline SMS, because of that brand, or they will be listening to it because they're going to know about Ken Banks from one of your projects or some of the initiatives that you've done. And many of them are thinking to themselves, how do I do that? How do I get started? How do I do that? Could you take us through, because Frontline SMS is one of the most well-known stories out there. How did that get started? What, did you just sort of, you had this idea, the classic, Silicon Valley thing, you sort of started programming it in your room and then put it out there? Did you go seek funding? What was the arc of actually getting to a place where it was sustainable and those kinds of things?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, from 93, when I started my work, going to Zambia that year and then doing the other things and studying it and so on, I'd obviously become very interested in some of the problems and what was wrong. And I felt there was not enough focus on grassroots organizations, that this top-down approach was still too dominant. And sadly, Frontline SMS came about in 2005. 10 years on, many projects are still far too top-down. But I was working around Kruger National Park 2003, 2004 on this conservation project. And what was happening was that after about 85 years, the parks authorities were starting to realize they probably should talk a little bit more to the communities around the park in order for conservation to be more effective. It's a bit of a no-brainer, but it took 85 years to figure that out. And once they started doing that, they came to me because I was happened to be around in the field, and said, look, we're seeing mobile phones appearing in the hands of the community members. There's about 30 villages around Bushbuck Ridge area, which is on the edge of the park. And some of the community members were getting phones, and they said, look, right now our social ecology unit have to drive around for about a day to organize meetings and set things up. And if things change, you've got to drive around for another day and change them. Is there any way we could send a message perhaps to key people within the communities to tell them about meetings or to ask them questions and to engage them more? So I looked around, and bear in mind, this is about 2004. I looked around for tools that would allow you to send a large number of text messages from a place like Kruger National Park, where very poor infrastructure. There's a mobile phone signal, but there's no internet access. There's very little power anywhere. Obviously, phones luckily run off their own batteries. And so I thought to myself, well, if Kruger National Parks want to send messages from a place like this using text message, then probably other people do too. So there's probably a need for something like this. But I kind of left it at that. It was sort of funny. I left it for 3 or 4 months, and I was sitting at home around January 2005, and I was watching football, or soccer, as the US would call it, drinking some beer, and just suddenly came up with the concept of, could you drive a mobile phone through a laptop and actually tell it to send text messages? And then could you read the messages back from the inbox and dump it all on a screen? So I went on eBay. I spent 15 quid getting a cheap phone and a cable, and I got the codes off the internet. And of course, I programmed before, so I knew how to code in a very primitive way. And it actually worked. I realized I could send a text message with 3 commands. And I thought, well, you could automate that. So I put a quick concept note together, started thinking about what I could do to actually build something like this, knowing, of course, there was only one real use case that it could be applied to at that point in time, which was in South Africa. And that summer, I went off to Finland, where my now wife lives, and I spent 5 weeks sitting on her kitchen table with a bunch of modems and phones and cables. I just started to learn how to write Windows apps because Commodore PET computers from the 80s were no longer around and being used, so I had to write a Windows app, and that was new. But I basically retaught myself programming whilst I built Frontline SMS. I did it in 5 weeks. I built the website very quickly after I gave an interview about the software. And then when I was asked what the website address was for the software, I realized I didn't have a website. So I halted software development for a day and I built the website. And in October that year, I launched it. So it was very much bootstrapped from that particular point in time. I just basically did it off my own back. And if I had put a project proposal together back in 2005, I don't know how well it would have been received. There was not a lot of evidence that it would have been useful. I hadn't done any kind of field work to get numbers and do surveys and that kind of thing. So I just sort of thought I'd write it myself. I also wouldn't know what to ask somebody to develop if I asked someone else to develop it. And I just released it in 2005, October 2005, and just let it out into the world, really.
So it was like the original open source, I guess, before open source became super sexy.
Well, it wasn't open source at that time.
I guess it was a Windows app, I guess.
That's right. It was a Windows app. So, also my coding was very rough and very scrappy. And, also there's been a bit of at least for me, a slightly ongoing battle with the sort of open source community in that everyone gets so uptight about things that aren't open source. There's this big push that if it's not open, it's evil. And I very much disagree with that. I still very much disagree with it today. And in fact, one of the principles for digital development, which came out recently, one of them basically says, you have to be open source, which I think is a very dangerous assumption. But the first version of Frontline SMS in 2005 wasn't. It didn't become actually open source until the MacArthur Foundation gave it its first grant nearly 3 years later. So the first 3 years it was self-funded, which I think maybe is another lesson in how you might go about building tools and actually building some kind of sustainability.
Two things there. We've got two threads there. We've had several people on the Terms of Reference podcast here who are open source proponents. Absolutely, open source is the way to go, open data, transparency, etc. Let's follow that path for a little while. Just give us a little bit more about why you think proprietary software is important.
I think that there's room for both, right? I think it's just a very dangerous when you take a broad brushstroke approach to this kind of thing. So I suppose one example I would give when we're thinking about this open situation is that there's increasing pressure on tools developers and organizations that work in technology to build sustainability into their work, to build business models and so on. And it's probably a little bit harder to do that if your product is fully open and anyone can grab it and do anything they want with it without really having to do anything or give you any money or give anything back to you other than perhaps the changes they've made to your code. It's a lot easier to actually build a business model, in my view, around something which is closed. So there's a slight disconnect, I think, in a way that perhaps open is better for the broader community, but if you're trying to build something that's going to last, then there's elements perhaps that may need to be closed to enable you to do that. I also don't think there's a huge amount of evidence, in fact, that open always works and closed always fails. And that sometimes is the attitude that I seem to get. We're living in an experimental phase right now, aren't we, after all? Everyone just gets excited about things in different phases. No one really quite knows. I would love to see some really quite rigorous, solid research on whether or not open source projects actually succeed far greater than closed source projects. And when you look at SourceForge, actually the evidence wouldn't play out because 99.5% of projects on SourceForge are dead.
Sure, and we can mention SourceForge for the people who are not tech savvy. I'll sort of cut that off there just because we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But, all you have to do is sort of look up, the difference between Windows and Linux and Red Hat and, the OS X for Mac. There's commercial and open source applications all over the place. So both play out and both are viable, at least in the commercial world on a regular basis. I mean, how many people have forked Android at this stage? And are building their own mobile apps or building their own mobile OS to use it that way, but then they close it to make it their own commercial application.
Absolutely. And, for me, my focus was always the end user. I was interested in the small community group working out of a church somewhere in a rural African country, a women's group, microfinance group, a rural hospital, a human rights activist. These people don't give a damn if it's open or closed source. They don't even know what open or closed source is. They want a tool that works for them, that they can adapt and use in whatever way they want, and a tool that works in their context. These big debates we have in development, they're usually and largely irrelevant to most of the people that really need the help.
What about bootstrapping your organization? You said for the first 3 years it was you. Were you getting funding at that stage, even if it was a trickle, or was this something you were funding through other projects? Or what I'm trying to get at is, how did you know that you needed to keep it alive? Was it just that cool of an idea, or was there really that, did you feel the interest, or what was the continued inspiration for 3 years until somebody gave you money?
Well, first of all, there was no cost to running it. It was maybe $30 a year to maintain the web domain. That was it. I would do technical support in the evenings. If somebody emailed me, I would fix bugs at the weekends and just throw it back out. I love doing that. But I felt very strongly that there was a need for a tool like that. And people seemed to really like the essence of what the software was trying to do. It was a tool squarely aimed at the bottom of the food chain, really, I suppose you could say, for nonprofits, those little scrappy grassroots users that nobody usually really cared about. So because there was no cost to keeping it going, it was a no-brainer to keep it going, really. And for me, actually, that sort of raises a really interesting conversation around sustainability in these organizations, because if something costs zero to run, it's sustainable. But nobody thinks about actually trying to get the cost down as low as they can. It's all about growing and getting it bigger the other way. But I ran it for nearly 3 years just that way. It got picked up slowly by people, didn't set the world on fire. But I was getting stories back from users in Zimbabwe and Afghanistan and various places, and they were telling me, look, if this didn't exist, we couldn't do what we're doing. And what we're doing is now the efficiency of it and the scale of it and the reach of it's been increased considerably because of the tool that you built. Of course, I never did the work. I just helped enable them to do the work. So it felt like it was worth keeping going. And then April 2007, it was used in the Nigerian elections and by a coalition of Nigerian NGOs. And then that became a big international story. The BBC picked up on it. And then MacArthur kind of called me up and said, MacArthur Foundation, and said, we like this tool. Do you need any money? And I thought,
the dream.
I haven't had any yet, so some would be nice. So they gave me a couple of $100,000 to build a new version of it. And the stipulation for that grant was that it was open source.
And there we go.
There we go.
So you've now done what we find is a rarity. I don't have any empirical research, but what we generally find is a rarity in the development humanitarian aid world. You've exited. Tell us about, you've gone through that whole arc now. So you had the idea, you had the genesis, you built the initial tool, you got seed money, you continue to grow it, you started having staff and bringing people on, and then one day you said, you know what, it's time for me to move on and let this thing live on its own. Take me through that process about how you made the decision to exit and then how you eventually said, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, well, I think perhaps it's just something that comes with age rather than sort of an aha moment. But I was, always aware of my limitations. I know what I'm good at. I can clearly code relatively well, even though it might be a bit messy. I'm pretty good at communicating. I really made a huge effort to understand grassroots users and understand the context of the people I was trying to help. As Frontline SMS grew, it became really a question, an issue of growing an organization. There was an interesting pivot point during that process because I was actually considering trying to take it down at one point, back down to the zero level where there were no costs and strip it down. And as an experiment, see if you could actually genuinely create a global tech organization with no staff and no costs and no office, which was kind of, along the sort of Napster kind of lines, really, along the stories that you read about. Actually,
or it's either that or it's the genesis of Anonymous. I'm not sure.
Well, that kind of thing, perhaps, yeah. There's a great book called The Starfish and the Spider, which I'd recommend for anyone to read, which is about these kind of headless organizations where no one's really in control. And I wonder what it would be like to do that. But the Omidyar network, Pierre Omidyar, eBay founders, organization approached me at that time and offered quite a good amount of money to scale and grow the organization. And I felt it was wrong to not give it that chance. The minute I made the decision to take that money, I was starting to basically get myself and work myself out of a job. And I realized that the organization was becoming too big. I wasn't really the right person to be running it. It needed new people to take it to the new level. And so I just did the very honest thing. I didn't want to bring it down. I didn't want to be that founder who didn't know when to leave and stuck around and dragged the thing right back down to the ground. And then it all got sort of destroyed. And we sort of see that to an extent. So it was just really a conscious decision just to kind of man up, I suppose, and say, look, what I've done so far I'm very happy with, but this is a new phase now. It's no longer about disseminating a tool and understanding the users and playing around with the code. It's about, it's audits, it's fairly lengthy, complex negotiations around grants and funding, it's HR policies with staff, it's opening up offices overseas, that kind of stuff. And that's not something that really gets me up in the morning. So I just decided it was time to go. And then we started to hire some pretty good staff, and it was clear they could probably take it on. So over about a 2-year period, we did a fairly lengthy transition, but I'd increasingly stepped back until the point that I was pretty much gone, and no one seemed to notice. So clearly it was okay. And I'm glad I did that. It was very well received at the time, and I think more people should do it.
My favorite questions to ask on this podcast is about a story or a time when you failed. We're really good at talking about successes. We're really good at talking about things that worked out. But is there a time when you just sort of really fell on your face, either Frontline SMS or another project where it just didn't work, and what you did to either pick yourself up or evolve it so that it did become a success?
Failure is one of those things we seem to have a slight obsession with, isn't it? And figuring out how we learn from failures. To be totally honest with you, I would say I probably have had a failure, but it's been made up of lots of micro failures along the way. There's never been a big moment where everything's collapsed under me. There have been times when I've released a version of the software, perhaps when I was on my own, and there was a pretty horrible, nasty bug in there. Or I was contacted by a user who was absolutely desperate to make it work for them, but couldn't get the right devices. And I felt a personal sense of failure that I wasn't unable to help them. There were times when I've maybe gone for money or gone for fellowships or gone for opportunities where I haven't succeeded. And clearly that's the failure as well. But for me, they're mostly micro failures. Frontline SMS was my first real attempt to do anything. And so maybe I just got lucky that I got it right the first time, but it did take 3 years to get traction. So maybe the sort of failure is mitigated, but by just being stubborn, I could have failed at that. Any point in those 3 years, I could have said, well, it's not got 1 million users. Everyone's obsessed with scale. It hasn't scaled. Let's close it down. So maybe that would have been a failure if I hadn't have just stuck it out and kept costs as low as possible. But
it might also be a case study in the. I find it interesting that you've brought us to the scale conversation, because that's something that the world is definitely obsessed with, and yet scale seems to happen after a lot of hard work, a lot of patience, and a lot of micro advances, as you say. Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is this general sense that things happen overnight now. We almost feel with some of these Silicon Valley, tech companies, they almost become billion-dollar companies overnight. There's often huge amounts of work to go in, blood, sweat, and tears to go in before that point. We only get to hear about them when they get that big. But I do feel this obsession with scale, with reach in development, with projects particularly, I think is very unhealthy. A project that's helping just 1 million people and can never help any more than 1 million people, it's not unworthy. It's doing a very, very good job. And if you think even about rare diseases, organizations that help people with rare diseases only have maybe 2,000 or 3,000 sufferers in the whole world. If you apply the scale model to that, nobody should fund it. Those 2,000 or 3,000 people should just suffer. No one's going to help them because any solution to their problem won't scale. I actually tweeted something yesterday about Twitter, all the problems Twitter's going through. Twitter could be a really nice, small, global player. It could have global reach, have a few 100 million users. It could be very successful, very profitable if it just stayed small. But it's IPO'd, and now it has to be big. It's got to grow. Every quarter it's got to grow. And it's going to kill it. And that's what happens, I think, to some really good ICT for D development projects. They become obsessed with scale, and funders become obsessed with scale. And small is beautiful sometimes. I really wish we got that a bit more.
Does that play into some of the large NGOs, the large contractors who, not even ICT for D, but just there's this obsession with continued growth, continued profitability, or just, continued expansion, you think, that plays into that a lot?
Yeah, I think it is. The problems on the planet aren't going away, and if in some areas they're getting worse. So there's nothing wrong, of course, with a donor wanting to get the biggest bang for their buck. But it's just how you measure that bang. And sometimes just a pure number doesn't actually really give you any kind of contextual information or knowledge of really what's happening at kind of an individual level. And almost anybody that you would talk to who works in international development and conservation, ultimately they do want to do good. But I think sometimes we just get sucked into a machine which becomes all about log frames, it becomes process, it becomes about getting the biggest amount of reach, the largest number of users, the number of people treated. It becomes about scale. It becomes about all those kinds of things. And I think they feel very kind of inhuman in a way. And in The Rise of Reluctant Innovator, I just found it fascinating that some people in that book that we profiled, in some cases had reached 300 million people in the case of Brij Kothari in India. But, he didn't have all these structures and this big international development system around him. And, maybe the ideas can blossom and grow and develop more naturally if they're not in a system which seems to be very, very impatient and forcing scale onto them.
You've told us about the app that you're building right now. You sort of alluded to the fact that it's going to be linked to giving in some way. What else do you have, or are you able to see 2, 3, 5 years out in the future for yourself and Kiwanja.net?
That's a great question. I'm right at that sort of crossroads at the moment. I've met the crossroads many times over the last few years and sort of wondered to myself whether or not I'd be more use in a larger organization, whether I should maybe I could in fact take on a smaller organization and help it grow, perhaps use some of my skills and experience if it were needed. I just want to go where I can add value. And that's almost a standard sentence in any email I get from people who ask for my help. I just say, look, if I can add value to your work, I'd be very interested in working with you or helping you. But, I kind of in a way have a dream job, although it's frustrating at times. I am independent. I've never worked been indirectly employed by any kind of large international organization. I've consulted with a few. But I tend to, I can write about things that frustrate me. I can write about things I love. I can propose solutions that other people maybe wouldn't be able to propose. So maybe I'm in a slightly privileged position. I've been doing mobile for probably almost as long as many people have. It's 13 years now. So maybe I should just carry on as I am. It seems that people appreciate what I do. I now focus a lot of my time on younger people and young innovators and students who are interested in getting the sort of first step on the career ladder of social change and social entrepreneurship, and in some cases, international development. And they seem to like my story because it's achievable. I didn't have huge amounts of money. I didn't have any privilege, didn't have any friends in privileged positions. My father wasn't running the World Bank or anything like that. I just kind of clawed my way up and stuck at things in a very stubborn way. And right now it looks pretty good, but I've had some blood, sweat, and tears along the way too, and people want to hear that. So maybe the value I add now is simply just sharing that story and helping other people get there, because many people seem to want to get there, and there are so many problems in the world today. We need as many people as we can tackling them.
So you've brought me to what is always the final question on these interviews here in terms of reference, and that is, over this arc of the last 15 years, 20 years, what are, for the individuals who are coming out of university or the people who are interested in transitioning to aid, development, conservation work from other sectors, when you're on that stage or when you're sending back that email, what are the one or two pieces of critical advice that you give them to, in order to create a sustainable or satisfying career here?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly it's the kind of information that people are crying out for. There's sort of 3 or 4 that I usually give. I think the first one is you really have to find something that you're genuinely passionate about. So, what's going to get you up in the morning, and perhaps what's going to get you up in the morning for the rest of your life, right? What troubles you? What's going to keep you going when you hit a wall and you have to fight through it? Because if you just pick interesting problems, it's easy to quit one interesting problem and pick on another. So I think passion is absolutely key. I think another is just getting out there and learning. We've discussed this over the last sort of half an hour or so. I think it is really important to have empathy and understanding for the people that you want to help. I think it's, if anything, maybe slightly disrespectful to people to imply that you can solve their problems without really understanding or knowing them. So I would say get out there. If you're young, you can get out there before you get mortgages, before you get married, before you get kids. Get out there, because you won't be able to do that. You also don't need qualifications to change the world. I think there's a big push to teach people social change. Social change isn't structured. It's not nice and orderly. It's messy. It's scrappy. It's challenging. It's full of tears and pain. So by all means, learn about it. But I would say, don't think you need a qualification to make the world a better place. This institutionalization isn't healthy. You can learn that later. I'm not saying education's wrong. Get the passion, find out what you want to do with your life, and then you can pick up as you go all the other skills that you might need. And also, I suppose the last one perhaps, the last 2 very quickly, I don't think you need to work at a large international NGO to work in international development. I think there's a lot you can do on your own. So don't necessarily feel you have to go the conventional route. I think particularly today, technology's democratized development for many people. You can build tools, as I did, and have an impact on your own. So don't make an assumption you need to go and work for a large organization to be in development, if you want to call it that. And the last one, if your ideal job doesn't exist, then just create it.
As you did.
As I did, yeah. It took a long time. But, you can. If you really want to make the world better and you want to contribute to making the world better, then maybe the best thing you can do is actually, first of all, get your own house in order, make a decision on what you want to tackle, find that passion, and then go the unconventional route if you have to. Disruption is good. International development is crying out for disruption. Maybe we just need to disrupt it a little bit.
Ken, thank you so very much for being a guest on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
No, you're welcome. It was fun. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.